It's time for another stream. We got here on YouTube. I'll copy the stream link and share it in the channel. Hopefully, folks come through again. Had to do this one early today because I have a whole bunch of meetings later today. I'll give you a quick look, a bunch of meetings and stuff like that. So, yeah, doing this now, and then tomorrow I'm going to be catching up on what I missed last week in terms of reading from Anarchy Primer, as well as the new chapter of Anarchy Primer. So, let's see where that goes. Let me go to my channel. So, if you recall, last week we left off talking about sections 13 and 14, in which was discussing. Oh, I have just now noticed that it's not showing my screen anymore. Wow, so y'all just looking at black. I'm so sorry. This is darkness, everybody, darkness. Luckily, I saw that before it went too far. Anyways, let's get it.
Easy enough for themselves. As for content, the other side makes it easy enough for themselves at times to display a great expanse of it. They appropriate a lot of already familiar and well-ordered material by focusing on rare and exotic instances. They give the impression they have hold on everything which scientific knowledge had already embraced in its scope, and that they're also in command of such material as is yet unordered. It thus appears that everything has been subject.
Let's back that up a little bit. Because, when we're just getting in here, it takes a little while for the brain to get into this way of thinking again. So let's is this probably going fast? Yeah, let me slow this down a little bit. We'll speed it up probably later. As for content, the other side make it easy. So remember, we left off of him talking about this Gordian knot of one side being the esoteric kind of knowledge of people, of scientists trying to understand the spirit and the mind, the consciousness, while the other side is kind of like the spiritual leaders, the intuitive understanders, people who want to feel like they know something rather than actually know something. So there's a difference between how people. Oh, my chat was not open. Yeah, so sorry, I just sound sorry. Horizons, thank you for coming. Oh, awesome. Thank you very much, Debbie. I appreciate that. Yeah, I haven't used any sort of advanced software. Just using free software that I find, just trying out different things. So it's still just experimenting with it. I'll probably reach out to you soon. But honestly, this is the most I can do on my current setup, this MacBook. I can't do anything more or else it will cut off. So, but thank you. I appreciate it. So where were we? Yeah, so we're talking about the Gordian knot between, the esoteric and people who are trying to comprehend the spirit and the mind and consciousness versus people who want to intuit, that they understand these sorts of things. So that's what he's talking about here, if I remember correctly, in terms of the other side, make it easy enough for themselves at times to display a great expanse of it. They appropriate a lot of already familiar and well-ordered material. By focusing on rare and exotic instances, they give the impression that they have hold of everything else, which scientific knowledge had already embraced in the scope, and that they are also in command of such material that is as yet unordered. So it's so interesting because once again, this is from the 1800s. This is from the 1800s that he's writing about this, and today we see the same problem, right? We see the same issue of like pseudoscientists or conspiracy theorists or kind of just woo folks. Unfortunately, they also term for this as holistic, practitioners. But I don't like to use the term holistic as a bad thing because I think holistic thinking is kind of necessary, especially nowadays. But nonetheless, the fact is, there's a lot of people today that do this. Take for instance quantum physics. All right, this really irks me because I love quantum physics and a lot of what it's doing, but a lot of people look at this quantum physics as like an excuse or a way of explaining really weird conspiracies and really weird spirituality stuff, right? And I'm a person that believes in spirituality. Like I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of spiritual practices, and I'm talking about spiritual from the sort of religious standpoints, not from a consciousness standpoint. But I separate that in my mind. Like I separate spirituality as this intuitive kind of thing that you feel and stuff like that versus science, right? And they are talking about different things. Like science allows you to kind of understand and measure things and study things, while spirituality allows you to kind of intuitively kind of feel experiences that you can't really understand or you can't currently explain. But science job is to look at spirituality and to try to pull from there things that you can explain to a greater extent. So it's a constant dance, right? Science is trying to learn from spirituality because I think initially we all have an intuitive understanding of how the world works, but we don't really understand how it works. And science allows us to understand that. But spirituality allows us to kind of quickly grasp onto things that are beyond our current level of comprehension. So I say it's a dance because many, even with with science, there's many aspects of the exotic, things, or like he says here, the unordered. There's a lot of aspects of science that science has not yet been able to explain, and therein lies the space for spirituality. At least that's how I see it in my mind. But unfortunately, a lot of people try to treat it as an opposing force, where spirituality must take from science and try to explain from a spiritual aspect, or science tries to over explain spiritual things that science can't currently measure, right? So yeah, it's interesting to see that they've had that same problem in
So in
ancient Egypt.
command of such material as is yet unordered. It thus appears that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea, which therefore seems to be cognized in everything and to have matured into an expanded science. But a closer inspection shows that this expansion has not come about through one and the same principle, having spontaneously assumed different shapes, but rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula, only externally applied to diverse materials, thereby obtaining merely a boring show of diversity.
That's interesting. Another bar. Man, Hegel be spitting bars here, man. Look, it says, the closer inspection shows that this expansion has not come about through one and the same principle having spontaneously assumed different shapes, but rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula. So to me, that's like saying the others, or the folks who are having an intuitive understanding of the world, takes like the shape of science, of like, oh yes, we understand this and we take this and we, build building blocks of knowledge. And it takes that general shape and, uses it to try and create a surface level understanding of everything else, right? Like take what I was saying with quantum physics, before I went off on that tangent. People take the shape of scientists, using the scientific method to discover quantum physics. But of course, with quantum physics, you can't study it directly, right? Because the uncertainty principle, as well as the what you call it, the I forgot what it's called, but the disturbance. Like when you try to measure with light, like light is like the only way you really have to measure it. When you try to use that light, it scatters everything, anyways. So um, in order to study quantum physics, you have to use advanced mathematics and all these other methods of thinking in order to understand this stuff, and other kind of indirect experiments, right? And it feels like pseudoscientists take that shape of indirect science and tries to use it to explain some other weird quantum. They just put the word quantum in there. They put the word uncertainty principle in there. They put the word parallel universes. You've heard that all the time: parallel universes, parallel worlds. They just put these words that you hear, these the shapes of things, into their own understanding, into their own kind of paradigm, to try and make it sound like it's esoteric, or like it's telling you something. But it's shapeless. Like it doesn't actually give you something, give you anything. And as it says here, only externally applied to different materials, or diverse materials, thereby obtaining merely a boring show of diversity, right? So it makes it look like it's different and like it's giving you something of value, but really it's not. It's just the makeshift view. And if I could take a tangent here too, this reminds me of the huge problem that we see today with diversity and inclusion, right? Where people see diversity as like a numbers game. And just, oh, have a person of this color, of that color, of that color, and just put them all there, and yeah, now we're diverse, right? But no, a boring show of diversity, right? It doesn't actually mean that you're diverse. You're not mentally diverse. You didn't look at their backgrounds, like where they came from, or the types of problems they're trying to solve, or the different cultures, or you didn't go into depth about the different people that you're bringing into your team. And because of that, you kind of again have this boring show of diversity. So I really like this. This is a really really awesome passage.
The idea, which is of course true enough on its own account, remains in effect always in its primitive condition if its development involves nothing more than this sort of repetition of the same formula. When the knowing subject goes around applying this single inert form to whatever it encounters and dipping the material into this placid element from side, this is no more the fulfillment of what is needed, that is, a self-originating, self-differentiating wealth of shapes, than any arbitrary insights into the content.
Hold on. Whoa. When a known subject goes around applying a single inert form to whatever it encounters, and dipping the material into this placid element from the outside. Placid element, as in, there's nothing here. It's kind of like, still water, right? It's kind of nasty. It's not much happening there. This is no more the fulfillment of what is needed, i.e., a self-originating, self-differentiating wealth of shapes. So yeah, he's saying that's what is needed. It's like we need to have this area where it's originating from the self, where it's originating from the study of what you're trying to learn, and you can understand, a bunch of different ways in which this new knowledge can be applied to something, and any arbitrary insights into the content. Yeah. Okay. So I just had to slow that
wealth
down.
of shapes than any arbitrary insights into the content. Rather, it is a monochromatic formalism which only arrives at the differentiation of its material, since this has already been provided and is by now familiar.
That's great. That's another bar. That's another bar right there. Rather, it is a monochromatic formalism which only arrives at the differentiation of its material, since this has been already provided and is by now familiar. Doesn't that sound like something to you? Like, again, it's so crazy how relevant this is today. Because once again, you have the same problem of these ideas, which, like the status quo, right? When you think about the status quo of how a certain business works or how a certain, thing is taught in school, right? What he says here, monochromatic formalism. It's already existing like that. It's the status quo. People think that this is the normal thing, that this is how things should go, but then you realize that no, it's there's a whole lot more that goes into it. And because people don't question that, people don't want to dig deeper into what you're trying to learn and what you're trying to engage with, then you're just passing along this this boring view of the world. And this is a huge problem with the education system today, right? Is that we just pass on these facts and just say, oh yeah, this is how the world works. This is how the world works. But you're not engaging people in the knowledge. You're not engaging people in how you learn these things and how you grasp onto these different ideas. And it makes all of this knowledge, right? Science, math, social studies, or rather history, literature. It makes all these subjects seem so boring, and that is deeply concerning. So yeah, it's crazy that he's talking about that here. Man, this is a beautiful passage, right? I'm just looking at it like goodness. I have to post this somewhere.
This has already been provided and is by now familiar.
All right, let's see how he adds onto this.
So now we come to a new section where we're going to a different side of this bifurcation. And he says, as for content, is what we're really interested in here, the other side make it easy enough for themselves to display a great expanse of it. So which other side are we talking about? Are we talking about the other side, meaning the side of the big picture intuition that we were just looking at a moment ago? Or are we talking about the side that may not have a grasp on where it's actually going overall, but at least can hunker down and make sense out of things by looking at the interplay between form and content, by organizing the things that it empirically studies? Here's an interesting thing to think about. Really, this could apply to both of them. Why? Because they're both trying to overcome that gap that we saw in between them. The side of the big picture, the big idea, now has to actually make good on that by showing that it can actually apply to a number of different types of content, that it can take it in and organize it.
Mm-hmm.
The other side has got to show that it can actually make good on saying, well, what the hell are you actually doing? How do you understand this activity of classifying, of differentiating, of organizing that you've been engaged in? What is your actual findings? What is the meaning of what you're up to? So He said,
and this is like a deep human thing, right? You hear it all the time, like, "Well, when am I gonna use this in class?" Like in the real world, when you learn some new math thing or just a new science thing in class, like, "Oh, when am I gonna use this in the world? Why would I need to know this?" Like that's basically this dialectic already in like the deepest, like, or the simplest part of the human mind is like we want to see the practicalities. We want to see, can you deliver the knowledge? It's not just about knowledge in and of itself, like you said before earlier in the other section. It's not just about edification. It's about the practical use. Like, how do you use this in your life? How do you apply this to the world? That's what we should demand. And it's sad because a lot of teachers and a lot of education, or a lot of schooling rather, kind of dismisses that. They say, "Oh, you got to know for the test. You got to know because whatever. You just throw a random thing in there." Most teachers, unfortunately, don't engage kids to be like, "Oh yeah, think about how you can use this. Here are some actual practical examples. Here's how you see this in everyday life, right?" And that is deeply problematic. So again, it's so crazy how relevant this is.
says that they can display a great expanse of content. And here's one of the fundamental questions that you have to engage with if you're trying to think about things in any sort of systematic manner. When you're studying something that you don't fully know, how do you in fact grasp, how do you get to the information? And then how do you articulate it? Articulating means how do you organize it? How do you structure it? How do you classify it? How do you differentiate things from each other? How do you decide what's most relevant and what's least relevant? How do you figure out what's most determinative and what's the determinant? How do you figure out where causality runs? Those are all ways of articulating content. And they go hand in hand because it's not as if you just first get the content and then start figuring out how everything's connected. The real way in which we experience things, even if we're carrying out the most careful research, is these are all kind of mixed up together. We have to work a bit to disentangle them. And notice I put content and then contents here. And I underlined the plural making S. Why did I do that? Because it's one thing to study a particular type of content. It's another to deal with things that are what we call heterogeneous. That means that they're of a different genre. They don't fit in with each other. So, we ought to be really suspicious in our own time when we see people making claims about brain science and morality, because those are two very different ranges, or even brain science and the emotions. Because the emotions, are they simple things? Are they just chemistry? Are they just interactions among neurons and, hormones and external stimuli? Or is there more of a, is there something more going on there? Are there multi-levels to these phenomena? If there are, then we have to have multiple ways of approaching different kinds of content. And we have to be a bit more careful about what we're doing. We don't want to shove everything into the same box. There's that old expression that to the man with the hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Right.
You don't want to be that guy if you're actually trying to do science. Because remember, what is science supposed to do? It's supposed to study the whole and to study it in all of its aspects, parts, features, and make sense of it. Now, if you're only...
Yeah, and it's crazy because this morning I was having my kind of biweekly networking meetup with a group of polymaths. So people who have a lot of different interests and have a lot of different kind of ways of viewing the world. And one thing we were talking about was the advantage of being a polymath, which is that ability to look at things from different perspectives and to connect the dots between things that are unsuspecting points of knowledge that you're bringing together. And it's interesting because a lot of scientists, in the early days in Hegel's time, were polymaths, right? They didn't just, like Newton, right? He wasn't just a physicist or anything like that. He was a physicist, a philosopher, a religious man, this, that, and the other. He put all these together in order to create his, the various Newton laws and the various Newtonian physics and algebra, whatever, not algebra. He created one of these types of math. I'm sorry, I'm not a math person, but he created, these different areas of knowledge. He didn't just stick to one, subject, right? And that's what's really important. Like Einstein was the same type of person. A lot of people know him strictly for relativity, but he was also very spiritual. He was also very knowledgeable about nuclear physics and all these, and math, of course, and all this other stuff. Like, to be really good at science and to understand and create even new types of science, or to understand science from different viewpoints, I think it requires you to be a little bit of a polymath, to look at things from different perspectives in order to bring them together and understand what he's saying here, the different contents, the different ways of looking at a certain subject.
Studying things under one lens, you sure can't study the whole, can you?
Right.
Because everything starts to look the same. So this is a real deep question. How do you deal with multiple contents? How do you deal with the fact that the same content may in fact be able to be looked at in very different aspects? It may have multiple sides, multiple facets to it. Those are important questions. Here's another question. How do you re-articulate what the people before you who were engaged in something, and let's say that what they were doing was scientific, but just not as scientific, how do you make sense out of what they did so you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time? And so you can actually incorporate their work and transcend what was false in it and incorporate what was true in it. That's what Hegel is grasping in this.
Yeah, I know I'm pausing a lot, but I'm gonna have to speed this up. 28 minutes in, goodness. That's what a lot of things that people forget about science. It's like, it's not about just disproving what was there before or dismissing everything that was there before in order, whenever you discover something new. It's looking at what was there before and trying to pull out the best parts of it, right? Pull out the best parts of it and replace the old parts with new stuff that we just learned, right? So it's not like, oh, we learned this new thing, and so therefore we were totally wrong before. Nothing we said before matters. I'm like, no, it still matters, but we realize that there's, in certain circumstances, this new knowledge applies better, or there's certain aspects of that wasn't quite true, and now we find something that's more true, right? So it's an additive. Science is an additive process rather than the subtractive, and I think a lot of people kind of miss that distinction, unfortunately.
As the central problem, he says. So this side makes it easy enough to display a great expanse of content. They appropriate a lot of familiar and well-ordered material. Focusing on rare and exotic instances, they give the impression they have hold of everything which scientific knowledge had already embraced in its scope. So they give the impression that they've taken in everything that previous science has already given us. They've fully understood it. They've assimilated it. They've digested it. They've made it their own. And they're also in command of such material as is yet unordered. So they've solved this problem too. They figured out how I'm going to get to all the things I don't know and figure out exactly what slots they go into. Because we know all the slots. It's just a matter of like finding the stuff to put into those slots. So he says they give the appearance that everything has been subjected to the absolute idea, which therefore seems to be cognized in everything to have matured into an expanded science. So they give the impression of having fully solved all of these issues. And they may not actually make the claim that everything is totally solved, but they'll say, look, we finally figured out the method. We have carried out the Copernican revolution. That there have been many different Copernican revolutions now, haven't there? That turned everything on its head, and now it's all downhill work from here, baby. That's the impression that efforts at science that aren't fully aware of what they're doing, that's the impression that they give because they believe that's the case.
Mm-hmm. And this reminds me once again of Russell Ackoff. So I've been looking into systems thinking, and he showed how the prior way of looking at the world was very mechanistic, right? Was kind of viewing the world as something that could be fully analyzed and fully understood by breaking everything down into unbreakable elements, into its most simplest elements. And that way of thinking kind of makes you assume that you can understand everything, that there isn't everything for you to understand, and that we as humans can understand everything, right? But systems thinking kind of changes that around, because what they discovered as you go more into the later stages of mechanistic thinking, which is like in the late 1900s, was that there's a lot of things that were missing, a lot of things that can't be explained, through typical science, like the laws of nature, or the laws of physics and things like that. Russell Ackoff says it really well. He says the laws of nature or laws of physics don't tell you what happens in every environment or any environment. It tells you what happens in no environment. So it doesn't derive from actual real world practicality. It derives from what happens in a pure vacuum. And as we know today, there's almost no place where there is in the universe where there is a pure vacuum. Like you have to create a pure vacuum, and even then, it's not really that pure. But you have to create it in order to get those perfect conditions for those perfect laws of nature to work. And so, all those laws that we kind of have, yes, they're useful, and we know we've learned a lot from it, but they kind of fall apart in terms of applying it to the real world because there's so much more complexity in how these different laws and things interact with each other. Um, but the problem I was trying to go here with this is that the mechanistic way of thinking made people think that we were at the end of science. Like I'm not sure if you recall or looked at a lot of the sciences from and engineering problems from the 1900s, but a lot of that stuff is like, oh, we're at the end of physics, we're at the end of engineering, we're at the end of information architecture. We've discovered everything we need to discover. Now it's all a matter of just putting things in the right places. But then we discovered a whole new stuff. Then the internet came out. Then relativity. Then space stuff. Then all this the genetics and all. Like we discovered that we're so far from the end of anything, right? And people are still worried about that now. Like the people are worried about, oh, if we figure out the grand theory of everything, right? The how gravity and quantum gravity relate, then we'll be there. We'll be at the end of science. We'll have described everything. But I guarantee you that there's probably a, a crap ton more that we're missing. There's so much more that we're going to be discovering. We're always going to be discovering more, just because our minds are so small, the universe is so large. But yeah, it's interesting once again seeing how relevant this is.
But what have they done? Here I have to erase a little bit. Have they really succeeded in what it is that they purport to have done or to be able to do? Can they make good on their promissory note? Now, of course, this is graphic representation, so really the whole ought to be the entirety of the chalkboard. But I just want to have some sort of bounded thing. So science is supposed to be taking in the whole. And I'm going to leave science sort of on the boundary right here because it's still not completely clarified whether science is something transcendent to the whole, the subjective observer is outside of it, or whether they should be considered part of it. That's going to come about in some of the later discussions. Here's what Hegel says they do. They take one basic conception and then they superimpose that on all the content of that whole. So if they're using medicine, everything looks like a medical problem.
Yeah.
Everything has to be solved that way. If they're a physicist, everything can be reduced to physical properties and the basic forces and particles.
That reductive.
If they're a sort of bigger picture kind of thing, let's say they're a sociologist, everything becomes a sociological problem. Everything is sociological categories. As a matter of fact, even knowledge, the knowledge that the physicists think that they have, those are just constructs. See where this is going. What they do, like Hegel says, is their expansion into the whole has not come about through one and the same. It has not come about through one and the same principle having spontaneously assumed different shapes. So this range of being requires a basic conception, but a basic conception that can take on another shape, another form, another mode of articulation. Instead, what they do is they just apply the same cookie cutter to everything. He says, rather through the shapeless repetition of one and the same formula, only externally applied to diverse materials, thereby obtaining a boring show of diversity. And that word boring there is really apt, because there's no better way to describe the person who's riding their disciplinary hobby horse all over roughshod, every bit of thing you could think about. It's boring. to talk to somebody who thinks that everything is physics. It's boring to talk to somebody who thinks that everything is logic. It's boring to talk to somebody who thinks that everything is a technological problem to be solved. It's boring to talk to somebody who can only talk about politics. They're a one-trick pony.
Spitting over here.
Why is that so boring? Is it just because they repeat themselves? No, because they could talk about a lot of different stuff. It's because we have this innate drive, this hunger, to use a word that Hegel's going to use later, Begierde, desire, to know reality. And reality doesn't just come in one flavor. As a matter of fact,
you hear that all the time in systems thinking, like systems don't exist. Like everything that we think we know about any sort of discipline or area of knowledge is our current perception of that thing, right? And so these different perceptions can change, and or rather, different people might have different perceptions of how we change, and all these ways in which we categorize information and knowledge in the world is only useful to us, right? And maybe in a later date, maybe when we someday discover some sort of other intellectual, creature, then maybe we can see, if our categories make sense to them as well. But so far, like it's only us. It's only us that this really applies to. The nature, the universe doesn't even care about our categories. Our categories are useful for us to understand the world. But unfortunately, a lot of people, categorize things a certain way and think everything has to follow along with that. So,
in fact, It doesn't just come in flavors. It comes in tones. It comes in shapes and sizes. It comes in hardness and softness. It comes in everything across the entire range that you could possibly think about. That is reality. So having just one way of making sense of that, one lens through which to view it all, that's going to be very boring. And it's going to be very boring because it's very artificial. It's, in many respects, dead. So he says, the idea, which is of course true on its own account, remains always in its primitive condition. It doesn't develop in this case. What makes it develop is when you actually have to apply yourself to different concepts. This is why Renaissance people are so interesting, because they've actually mastered different fields, and they didn't just look at them as all the same. Even if you're like, great at languages, one of the things that'll make you great at languages, you don't expect every language to be similar to the other one. You don't expect everything to be mutually translatable. You don't just walk in and say, all right, what's the syntax? What's the grammar? I just want to learn this as form, and now give me the vocabulary, and all right, now I speak Swahili. It doesn't work like that. You actually have to, and this is going a little bit beyond what Hegel's saying here, but I think this is a very important point. You have to have a sort of relationship of, if not at least, not love, at least desire to engage with what it is that you're trying to study. And this is going to be different from this, and this part's going to be different from this. The human body will be different than society, will be different than technology, will be different than animal, purely animal behavior, which will be different than particle physics. You can't use the same basic one single idea to make sense to them all. That sort of reductionism is boring. So he says, when the knowing subject goes around applying the single inert form of whatever it encounters and dipping the material into this placid element from the
why is I don't know why my stream is like cutting off. You're failing me, Melon. Maybe it's my Wi-Fi. I don't know, I'm back, seems, I think. Let me double check on my channel. Hello, testing. Okay, I think it's working. Yep. I hear my weird voice. Oof. All right, let's continue.
Science has needs. It has needs because it's human subjects who are engaged in it. And those human subjects are using science to get to know about things, to understand things, and to understand themselves, and understand their location in time and history and in the whole realm of meaning. So this doesn't fulfill us, because what do we need? A self-originating, self-differentiating wealth of shapes. And he talks about this as a monochromatic formalism. What does that mean? it paints the whole world one color. Could be gray, could be pink, could be whatever your favorite color is.
And a quick tangent too, you know, like my tangents is that we see the same problem with culture, right? With suburbanism and kind of this industrial complex of car dependency in suburban environments, and that it's making our entire culture, our entire architecture, you know, seem monochromatic, in which every subdivision, you know, is made the same. Like it looks basically the same. And every, you know, every state, every city, every country, even like there's subdivisions in America that look the same as subdivisions in Australia, which look the same as subdivisions in Africa. Like, why? These are completely different places with completely different histories and peoples, and yet we impose this one way of looking at the world, this cookie cutter, right? um, Cookie cutter way of looking at the world. And we say, just use this formula, right? And what does that do? That divorces us from our sense of true diversity, our sense of understanding of these multiple, no, the multiplicity of shapes and different ways of looking at the world, right? Like if you look at a subdivision, you say, oh yeah, it's diverse. I got a 2-story house, a ranch house, you know, the garage, you know, yeah, it's diverse. No, it's not, right? There's no multifamily housing here, right? There's no courtyards. There's no small rise apartments and stuff like that. There's no mom and pop shops over here. Like it's divorced of that true flavor that makes life so interesting and so different and so unique to each culture and to each community. And it's sad that we see this not only in the physical world, but in the you know the spiritual, the mindset, the mental world as well. It's definitely problematic. Oh, the dark one, welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming. It's probably because once you have construction methods down, it makes it cheaper to build it everywhere. Yeah, yeah, and that's problematic because you know sometimes you know, or really a lot of times we learn that cheaper is not better, right? Cheaper is not necessarily better. Oftentimes, cheap is cheap now, but it's expensive in the long run, right? We pay those costs somewhere, and if we pay those costs in the long run, you tend to collapse because you don't even realize you become that what you call it, the frog boiling problem, where you're dying a little at a time and you don't even notice the problem until it's too late. So it's definitely problematic. Cheaper isn't better, of course, but economical is better than something wasteful. Yeah, yeah, but that's another part of the problem, right? Like, what is economic? Right? If we define economical as something that is, you know, is budget friendly now, but it's not really thinking about what the budget will look like in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years, then, you know, is it still economical? You know, a lot of times, a lot of these economics, whether it's, you know, in the companies that's trying to be profitable or something like that, is looking for short term gains, right? Looking for short term profits. And that, once again, it comes at the cost of long term profits. That's why a lot of these companies who were really big, you know, 10, 20, 50 years ago are null and void today, right? Because they kind of start just cookie cutting everything and lose that ability to innovate and to adapt. I should have used economical, not cheaper. Yeah, I think it's either way. I definitely understand where you're coming from, but I think that's also part of the problem, right? Is that cookie cutter aspect of even viewing it as an economic problem, right? Because sometimes you can't view culture through an economic lens, right? We're trying to view these different nations, these different histories through an economic lens, and that divorces you from understanding the people on the ground, right? The people and their history and what they're trying to accomplish, their goals, their futures, and all this other stuff. Like, yeah, economy and kind of an economic lens is useful, but we're applying that way too much. We're applying that to every other part of society, and that comes at the cost of these other parts of society. And I think we see the same problem that Hegel was talking about here with knowledge in general, with science. If you view the world through a biological lens, you know, you're not really going to be able to understand physics or, you know, sociology or uh, language or all these other different ways of thinking. You know, sometimes you have to change how you're thinking in order to understand a different aspect of reality. And I think that's what's missing today. And it's apparently it's has been what was missing in the 1800s as well. Um, I imagine it's because that was still in the age of this mechanistic, way of viewing the world. But I hope we'll get more into that too.
But guaranteed, if you paint everything that color, you're going to get pretty sick of it before too long, because some things are just not going to fit that, and you're not going to be able to really tell anything apart from anything else. Yet this formalism maintains that such monotony and abstract universality are the absolute, and we are assured that dissatisfaction with it indicates the inability to master the absolute standpoint and to keep hold of it.
Oh my gosh. Already, like, this is exactly what I'm talking about here, right? This formula maintains that such monotony and abstract universality are the absolute. So it's basically what you're saying here, Darkwing. A lot of folks talk about economics or capitalism or whatever way of thinking, whether it's physics. I don't know, it doesn't matter. But you might have one way of thinking about the world, and you say, "Oh, this is explains so much. We've gained so much from this. Therefore, it should apply to everything, right? We can explain everything through this." But we don't. We can't. And unfortunately, when you disagree with them, when you say, "No, you can't explain culture through economics or biology through physics," they say, "Oh no, you just don't understand it enough." Right? You just didn't master enough. You just didn't, right? So it becomes a self satisfying problem, right? Where you can't even get out of that way of thinking, because it's like a cult. It's like you can't leave the cult or they'll kill you, or they'll say, "Oh no, you have to stay." And stuff like that. It's like the cult of the mind.
Time was when the bare possibility of imagining something differently was sufficient to refute an idea. And this bare possibility, this general thought, also had the entire positive value of an actual cognition. Nowadays, we see all value ascribed to the universal value of
I have to slow it down a little bit. Time is when the bare possibility of imagining something differently was sufficient to refute an idea, and this bare possibility, this general thought, also had the entire positive value of an actual cognition.
An actual cognition. Nowadays, we see all value ascribed to the universal idea in this non-actual form, and the undoing of all distinct determinate entities, or rather the hurling of all of them into the abyss of vacuity without further development or any justification, is allowed to pass muster as the speculative mode of treatment.
Ooh, he was going at somebody with that. Rather the hurling of them all into the abyss of vacuity without further development or any justification. Yeah, we see that once again today. It's like he was like, "Oh yes, we can explain everything with this one way of thinking. You have to, describe it more." And then, yeah, it's just that's what we allow as like speculative thinking or knowledge or um, economics or anything like that. Like, we see this problem in many aspects of our lives today. But yeah, well, I'd love to see more ideas on that. Like, Darkwing, if you have another viewpoint on that, if you disagree, let me know.
Justification is allowed to pass muster as the speculative mode of treatment. Dealing with something from the perspective of the absolute consists merely in declaring that although one has been speaking of it just now as something definite, yet in the absolute, the A equals A, there is nothing of the kind, for there all is one. To pit this single insight, that in the absolute everything is the same, against the full body of articulated cognition, which at least seeks and demands such fulfillment, to palm off its absolute as the night in which, as the saying goes, all cows are black, this is cognition naively reduced to vacuity. The formalism, which recent philosophy denounces and despises only to see it reappear in its midst, will not vanish from science, however much its inadequacy may be recognized and felt, till the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. Since the presentation of a general idea in outline before any attempt to follow it out in detail makes the latter attempt easier to grasp, it may be useful at this point to give a rough idea of it, at the same time taking the opportunity to get rid of certain habits of thought which impede philosophical cognition.
Yeah, I know he's going to get into it, but I'd like to get into it myself first. Like this part here, the formalism which recent philosophy denounces and despises, only to see it reappear in its midst, will not vanish from science. Yeah, and it did not. It did not. Unfortunately, it kind of prospered in a way. However much inadequacy may be recognized and felt, till the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. Goodness, a bunch of big words here. Okay, let's break it down a little bit more. However much inadequacy may be recognized and felt, to the cognizing of absolute actuality has become entirely clear as to its own nature. So as we think about this thing, right? As we think about the idea of the absolute, of the idea of a universal concept, right? That's able to explain everything. Um, as you try to explain everything through this universal concept, you'll probably come up with a bunch of problems and a bunch of exceptions to the rule that makes you realize that, well, hopefully, if you're humble, right, it makes you realize that there's too many holes in your idea for it to be a universal idea. That it has to, apply to only a certain circumstance or a certain area of knowledge, and that it falls short in certain other contexts. At least that's what I'm getting from it here.
Sure. Since the presentation,
and that's this part, since the presentation of a general idea and outline before any attempt to follow it out in detail makes the latter attempt easier to grasp, it may be useful at this point to give a rough idea of it, at the same time taking the opportunity to get rid of certain habits of thought which impede philosophical cognition. So yeah, once you realize that there's so many holes in your arguments, right, that your way of understanding the world kind of falls short, then this is an opportunity for you to be like, okay, I need to change things up. I need to change, maybe not use the same pattern, not use the same cookie cutter pattern. Like we see this with subdivisions and everything like that. We think it's cheaper, we think it's more economic, and then down the line, we're actually losing money. Like this is a huge problem with car dependent suburbs today, right? We thought it was economic to copy the same design everywhere and to use the same area, to have everybody use cars. But now we realize that there's not enough tax revenue in these subdivisions, and so a whole bunch of cities are actually in debt today because they they didn't realize that they weren't getting enough profit from all of these subdivisions, right? So you see the same problem in different ways of knowing. Um, there's a word for a model that tries to explain everything. Models like that are too fluid and they can't really explain anything. Yeah, yeah. But unfortunately, a lot of people, thank you, the dark one. A lot of people do that anyway, right? They take one thing, and they could be really smart people. The insidiousness of this problem. It's like they could be extremely smart people, really really smart economists, yeah, economists, or physicists or biologists, right? They get really good at their subject area, and then they try to apply their same way of looking at the world to everywhere else, and you might be able to find some similarities and things like that, but they go too far, right? On the other hand, folks who do this real are like Renaissance man, polymaths, like Alan Turing, right? This dude was incredible. Not only did he just use a lot of the knowledge that was there before to crack, all these computer codes or all these, codes and everything like that, but he also studied biology, right, to understand genetics and everything like that. And he looked at it from a different perspective. I don't think he tried to apply his same way of knowing for cracking codes and security into biology, but he was able to use mathematics and all these other ways in order to discover new ways of knowing from like I was just seeing a video about how he discovered how like patterns arise on zebras and cheetahs and all these other animals and things like that. And we were able to look back at his mathematics to see how that also works for how hair is distributed on the human arm, or how different plants distribute their stuff. Like you have to look at the world differently in order to explain different things. The important key here is not that you use one way of knowing to explain the world, even if it's a really good way of knowing, but that you're able to switch your way of knowing when you need to.
Of a general idea and outline before any attempt to follow it out in detail makes the latter attempt easier to.
I'd love to know too, like for the Dark One or anybody else, listening later on in the comments, who are some people that you think change the way that they view the world? Who are some? It could be polymaths or other folks that did really well in one subject, but then was able to flip how they see the world and do really well in other subjects too. Like I would love to see some other examples of that.
Grasp. It may be useful at this point to give a rough idea of it at the same time taking the opportunity to get rid of certain habits of thought which impede philosophical cognition. In section 16, we now come to the famous passage about the night in which all cows are black. And that's a really great catchphrase, but what is it really about? What is Hegel criticizing there?
John von Neumann. Yeah. I haven't studied him too much, but I know a little bit about him just from the von Neumann probes, that type of sci-fi stuff. I definitely want to look more into him because I've heard a little bit about him. Thank you.
Commentators will steer us towards the German idealists of his own time, in particular his close associate, who he worked with quite a bit, and was somewhat in the shadow of, and that's Schelling. And Schelling, his philosophy, if you look at Hegel's construal of it, his philosophy is really not that successful of a project, and it does seem to fit this formalism that he's talking about, but really Kant's philosophy fits this as well. And I think that we can go far beyond this and see that, the sort of thing that we were looking at in the last passage, the idea that we can take one disciplinary way of looking at things and extend it to everything, all reality, and say that we don't need to really develop the science any further, we don't need to develop the discipline any further, and we can grasp the totality. That's the formalism that he's talking about. So that's kind of timeless. That's going to come up over and over and over again.
Yeah, we see that.
So let's look at what he starts out with. He talks about the absolute in this case. And the way in which these people portray the absolute is, in Hegel's eyes, a false understanding of the absolute. It's not really doing the absolute justice to reduce it to a kind of monotony, as he says, A equals A, or this is the statement of identity. A thing is what it is. The whole is what it is. The death, or the nucleus, or the whatever it is that underlies everything, that's what it is, and that's all you got. And then over here on this side, we have experience, which is determinate, which is of things that exist, that interact with each other, that are distinct from each other, and that are differentiated from each other, and which differentiate themselves from each other, that are connected in particular relations. And what's the problem with this? This is that monochromaticism that he was talking about. If we take this perspective on the absolute, then all of this really doesn't matter. I mean, you can have your own little experience, but it's all really going to be the same because it's all in the same absolute. Everything is in.
This is hilarious because I think about a week or two ago, I did a podcast, really weird podcast, where I was talking about the infinite complexity of a blade of grass. And I was kind of pointing out how, if you really pay attention to a blade of grass, it really is mind-bending how amazing it is, how complex it is. Because technically, every single blade of grass that you see is different than every other blade of grass, right? So theoretically, you could say, oh yeah, a blade of grass is this, it is what it is. We think we understand blades of grass, or grass in general. But when you really look into it, you can actually spend an eternity just trying to understand a blade of grass, because you can understand what differentiates this blade of grass from that blade of grass from that blade of grass, like the different ledges on it, and the different molecules that make it up, and the different ways this looks in the light, and how it feels in your arm, or how it feels to your feet, or what can you eat it, or what happens if you eat these different things, or how can you tie it, or like you can go all day. Just like the more curious you are of a thing, the more in depth that you look into a thing, the more you realize how unique and different it is, and how much we kind of pan over these differences, how we kind of just ignore a lot of this in order to go through life, and that's okay, right? Like, you don't have to understand how every blade of grass is different from every other blade of grass. It's not really, for most purposes, it's not really necessary to do that. But the fact is that you can, right? Because reality is just that complex. It's just that all-encompassing and crazy and interesting. And it's interesting because here it sounds like people are doing that in like this wider world of philosophy or physics or other types of sciences, like imagining, one way of knowing the world is like saying one blade of grass is the same as any other blade of grass. Like, no, not really. Like you can generalize it and say yes, there are a lot of similarities, but it's not literally the same. It can't literally be the same because then we would literally only have one blade of grass. um, I don't know, just a funny thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So he says, this is the night in which all cows are black. Cows are distinct things, and they're wandering around. And I suppose that, if you bump into them, you're going to know that they're there. You hear them move, you're going to know that they're there. But it doesn't do you any good because you can't see them. You can't differentiate them. I suppose if you were blind, you could say, well, I'm at an advantage when it comes to cows in a dark night. But Hegel is saying here, this is just not going to work. This is not going to be a successful way for philosophy to conduct itself, to make sense out of its own project. And he's building up to kind of a crescendo here. Notice that he's been carrying out, he started out the preface by saying, yeah, you can't really write a philosophical preface because, everyone expects you to put all the main stuff in and just leave all the content out. And that doesn't work for philosophy. And here's why, because philosophy has to be something where there's a dynamic engagement between the content and form. And then he moves into all these criticisms. And he spent a lot of time on the criticism of the notion of relying on intuition and this fuzzy, kind of hazy sentimentality. And then, this notion of science as something that just, takes in information sort of indiscriminately and kind of orders it, but doesn't really know what it's doing with it. And then this transcendental idea of the absolute, this may as well be the Kantian thing in itself, that because you can't really do anything with it. It doesn't get you anywhere.
I don't know anything about Kant, so if anybody does, please feel free to, educate me in the comments or anything, something like that. I know I'm not gonna look it up right now because I'm gonna go on a whole tangent if I do. But feel free to share, some of what your knowledge about Kant is, because I'll hear a lot of, back and forth between us. So it's interesting. It seems to be one of his main criticisms. Hegel is doing against folks like Kant. So seems to be just that kind. But let me know. Let me know what Kant is all about. If you can even preface this stuff, because Hegel says you can't. But maybe because if Kant believes in this absolute, maybe that's a problem, is that you can preface this stuff.
So what is going to get us somewhere? He says that what we want to avoid is hurling things into vacuity. And what does that mean? Hurling things into emptiness, into meaninglessness. We don't want to reduce our experience to meaninglessness. And we don't want the absolute to become something meaningless in the process. Instead, what we're going to have to do is bring together the experiential, the historical, the developmental. There's going to have to be an interplay between the two. That's the only way in which the absolute is actually going to be something more than abstract universality. We don't want abstract universality. We want concrete universality. We want something determinate, right? Something that we can see. And you can say, well, that you're asking for something that simply can't be provided at this point.
Sorry, the dog barks every time somebody comes.
The very notion of a universal means it has to be abstract. Hegel's on the scene to say, how do you know that? Are you sure about that? Let's actually give this a try and see whether not only can it happen, but perhaps it's already been happening all this time. That's what the bulk of this book, the Phenomenology, all these pages, this entire work is about. It's retracing the steps of that. And he says, since the presentation of a general idea and outline before any attempt to follow it out in detail makes the latter attempt easier to grasp, I'm going to try to give you a rough idea of it. And at the same time, taking the opportunity to try to get rid of some bad habits, some bad mental habits, some assumptions, some built-in biases that we have that can impede philosophical cognition. In my view, which can be justified only by the exposition of the system itself, everything turns on grasping and expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. At the same time, it is to be observed that substantiality embraces the universal or the immediacy of knowledge itself, as well as that which is being or immediacy for knowledge.
So he mentions this before. Oh my gosh, my daughter's going crazy. Expressing the true not only as substance, but equally as subject. I wonder what he means by that difference, because I know the substance he's talking about is like kind of like the content of like what it is, like what makes this substantial, what makes this something that is, fulfilling for people to know and to understand. I guess the subject by then is the topic, right? What he's talking about. Yeah. So like, what's the subject, or what is the thing that philosophy should be discussing or should be trying to figure out, versus the substance is like what makes it fulfilling. What way, like when you figure out what you're talking about, what makes that that knowledge fulfilling and practical to use.
Expressing the true, not only as substance, but equally as subject. At the same time, it is to be observed that substantiality embraces the universal or the immediacy of knowledge itself, as well as that which is being or immediacy for knowledge.
And remember that immediacy is like something that's that you can't ignore. That's like right in your face. It's like, oh yes, it's practical. It's like right here. I get it. I can use it. I can apply it and things like that. At least that's how I'm, interpreting.
If the conception of God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, the reason for this was, on the one hand, an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. On the other hand, the opposite view, which clings to thought as such, to universality as such, is the very same simplicity as undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality. And if
God, he's saying the reason for this was, on the one hand, had an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. Interesting. So like kind of what he was saying before, right? It's like it was the spirit, the mind, the consciousness was kind of drowning in this idea of this intuitive understanding of the world, but it wasn't really, you weren't preserving, as in you weren't getting to the meat of what it means to be conscious, right? Kind of, yeah, similar to what he was saying before, and that when you have this intuitive view of the world, this absolute, this God, you kind of are content and feeling like what you're talking about, but it doesn't really get to store the knowledge, right, of what you experience, because you can't really store a feeling, right? If I feel something, you don't feel something, right? The only way for you to know what I'm feeling is for me to try to explain it, for me to try to get down to help you feel what I feel by having a comprehensive understanding of how I feel it and stuff like that. So you can kind of store knowledge, but you can't store a feeling. And that's kind of how I see the difference between being submerged versus preserved.
Self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. On the other hand, the opposite view, which clings to thought as such, to universality as such, is the very same simplicity as undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality. And if, thirdly, thought does unite itself with the being of substance and apprehends immediacy or intuition as thinking, the question is still whether this intellectual intuition does not again fall back into inert simplicity and does not depict actuality itself in a non-actual manner.
So how can we make sure that thought, that knowledge, that this comprehension and understanding of the world, stays in that level, right? How do we make sure we don't descend back into just, feeling intuitively that we understand it and stuff like that? And again, it's very relevant, because we see that today, like even when we understand something and we get to a point where we understanding more about consciousness, how do we make sure that doesn't become some pseudo scientific aspect of, okay, we reach some level of understanding about consciousness and the conscious experience, but now people are just like, oh, it's whatever, right? Just this narcissistic mindfulness. Like, we understand now that mindfulness is important, meditation is important, but now people get like kind of content in that meditation. They don't really go further and to understand the depths of meditation or mindfulness and what that means and how it's applied and all this other stuff. So how do we make sure that we stay above board with that and keep pursuing more? Okay, pause it again. Okay, good.
Now, a lot of people get excited about Section 16 because of the, night in which all cows are black metaphor, which is, you got to admit, a great turn of phrase. This is one of the sections that I think is really key. There's a ton of stuff that's being prefigured here, and Hegel's starting to lay out some of his cards on the table.
Okay.
Remember, in the previous section, he just said, all right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we're going. Now I'm actually going to start doing a preface, and I'm going to try to wean us away from some of the bad habits of thought that are going to keep us from making progress on this road. So he says, in my view, which can be justified only by the exposition of the system itself, that we've already heard that part, here's where it gets really cool. The grasping or the expressing, and there's a reason why I put one above the other, of the true has to take place not only as substance, but as something else. We'll come to that in just a moment. So let's think about this. Grasping the true. Grasping truth means apprehending it, taking it in, being able to see the true as true.
Mm-hmm.
Grasping and expressing, they're not exactly the same thing, are they? But they call to each other, and they're mutually implicated within each other. Because if you grasp something as true, you can actually explain it, for Hegel, to another person. You're able to express it. You're able to express it at least to yourself. Grasping and expressing, there is already an engagement.
Yeah, you kind of hear that with the what do you call it? The oh my gosh, how am I forgetting his name? Goodness, I'm blanking, but like a great way of knowing is like they say, if you don't know something well enough until you can describe it easily or something like that, so you can describe it simply. I know there's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it's very similar. Like you have to be able to grasp something, right? To be able to understand and wrap your mind around something fully, or at least to a good enough extent, in order for you to express it, in order for you to communicate to somebody else. And in doing so, in communicating what you know and what you've learned, you're able to, grasp some more. Because while you're communicating with somebody else, you might realize that, oh, you actually had some holes there, or maybe there's something about it that you didn't understand, or maybe they asked you questions which made you go even further beyond what you thought you understood. So yeah, I would love to hear, in the comments what you all think about grasping it and expressing and the role that plays in understanding this sort of knowledge and things like that.
Dialectic between them. So grasping the true, or the truth, as substance. Now, when we say substance, the traditional metaphysical notion of substance is that which is most real, that which is fundamental, that which literally is that which other things are based upon. That's sort of the Aristotelian conception, and that does make sense in this respect.
Aristotelian,
so
like Aristotle?
Grasping being, grasping truth as substance. But Hegel says we have to grasp it not only as substance, as that which underlies everything else.
Oh my gosh, is one person of a dog too?
As subject. That's revolutionary. And this is where, I'm a huge fan of Aristotle, and so is Hegel, by the way. And I think that Hegel and Aristotle actually, share quite a lot more in common than people give them credit for. This is one of the things that's left unthought in Aristotle's work. And I'm not just talking about mind, thinking itself, or thought thinking itself. I'm thinking about the ordinary human being. and the fact that we are, substances that are at the same time subjects. And Aristotle doesn't just think this about individual human beings. He's willing to say that, he doesn't use the word substance for this, but he talks about the nature of a thing. And this is in Politics, Book 1. The nature of a thing is that which it is when it's completed. And what would be examples of things? Horse, man, house. And it doesn't just mean house in the sense of like a heap of bricks over there. Oikos can also mean, a mini community. Because then he goes on and he talks about, greater unities, greater wholes. So to grasp the true, not only as substance, not only as what is most real, or at least what we take to be most real, but also as dynamic, as active, as being something like us. That's also to grasp ourselves as being involved in there. Substance and subject have a dialectical relation with each other.
Dialectical, there we go.
Then he goes on to talk about what does substantiality actually involve or encompass. He says that it encompasses the universal, the immediacy of knowledge, and we'll come back to that in a second, and it also encompasses being, or the immediacy for knowledge. Now, I want to tune you in to the...
Yeah, of is like the immediacy of like knowing that there is more to know, right? That there's things that we can know, and then foreknowledge is like the desire that he was talking about before. At least that's how I'm thinking like that. I like to make these little predictions, so I think that's what the distinction he's making here.
Importance of these two little words. They're going to show up over and over and over. This distinction between the of and the for. Or, to put it another way...
I might have to pause this. I'm almost done. Can I pause this? I can't really pause this.
Being in itself, being for itself. This constant back and forth that has to do with, interestingly enough, mediation. We're looking at immediacy here, which means the lack of mediation, or at least what appears to be the lack of mediation at this point. But really what we're talking about is mediation, there being something that acts as a mediating term that makes something else possible, that conditions it, that works with it, that we have to see as also part of the process, as being involved in this. So substantiality is not just one single thing. It's already encompassing a number of different aspects or facets. Here we're doing some pretty high-level, hardcore metaphysics. That's why this passage is kind of head-splitting. People look at it and they're like, what the hell is all this stuff about? So substance and subject, substantiality.
Yeah, I missed all of that.
The immediacy of knowledge. What does that mean? That means that what we know presents itself to us as if it's just there. We know it as this, and that's all there is to it. There's no more to the story. Being, that which we're actually knowing, not just the universal through which we're knowing. Being is a deeper form of immediacy for knowledge, which then shows us that knowledge is mediating being. Being gives itself to us. This is what substance means. Being gives itself to us as something that our knowledge, which is through universals, is related to. And the universal is sort of like the medium, the term through which we grasp what's actually out there. Now, how does that work when we're talking about not just substance like what this piece of chalk is, but subject, when we're talking about ourselves? And Hegel here talks about God. Why is he talking about God in this context? He says,
It's kind of how we understand ourselves.
if the conception of God as the one substance shocked the age in which it was proclaimed, why would that shock an age? Because we're moving from substance being something like prime, whatever prime matter is going to be, or in the case of thales, water, or the elements, or who knows what, to being something that is a subject, active. If you take the traditional Jewish, Christian, Muslim monotheistic conception of God as that which is most real, God is a subject, not just the divine substance. So, like it says, the reason for this was, on the one hand, an instinctive awareness that in this definition, self-consciousness was only submerged and not preserved. The individual human being in relation to God is really a nullity, a nothing.
Right.
God becomes the sole subject, the sole thing that really has pure actuality and activity. On the other hand, the opposite view, which claims that thought as such, to universality as such, is the very same simplicity, is undifferentiated, unmoved substantiality. So if I focus in on my own status as subject, what I'm doing is I'm focusing in on something that it's very hard to say, well, what is it to be a human being? What is it to be a subject? And then he says, if thirdly, thought does unite itself with the being of substance and apprehends immediacy or intuition as thinking, the question is still whether this does not fall back into inert simplicity and does not depict actuality in a non-actual manner. So we're setting out a problematic here. Hegel is not solving an issue in this one. He's actually laying out a problematic for us. And he's saying that this is the heart of the problematic, that we have to understand the true as substance and subject, which means that we're ourselves already implicated in it, and not only are we implicated in it, but other subjects are also implicated in it. We could talk about intersubjectivity of other individual beings, but from early on, we're also talking about the divine as being itself a subject. And then the question is, well, how the hell am I related to the divine? Right. I'm actually the one who's grasping it. I'm the one who is developing some knowledge of it, whatever knowledge I may be able to develop. How is that happening? And this he's going to leave as a set of problems to explore.
Goodness, yeah. So that was interesting. So sorry for the noise. Probably gonna have to come back and rewatch that last part a little bit more later. But yeah, that's crazy. I miss a lot of that. This is once again the great reason why it was great to listen to Dr. Sadler here. But goodness, yeah, that's a lot of awesome stuff there to break down. Fortunately, I do have to go. I got an interview soon and a lot of stuff going on in my house. So thanks as always for listening, for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this episode and what you thought about what you got from this. Whether it's Dr. Sadler's comments, Hegel's, words and writing, or just my own weird, tangents and things like that. Let me know what you got from this and what you would like to, this to look like. If you want this to be more engaged or whatever. I'm super excited to just learn alongside folks with this sort of things. It's so amazing that we can learn these sorts of things online for free. And yeah, thanks again. And let me go to the big screen here. Yeah, it's my face here. got my little twist. But yeah, thank you for watching, for listening, and tune in for the next couple of episodes. Check in the description. I actually put some. I'm going to start putting plugging in my other stuff. I have an audio journal kind of podcast where I talk about all sorts of things. A newsletter. It's super long. The last one was like 10,000 words. And by the end of the year, I'm probably going to be writing whole novels in my newsletter. But I talk about more refined ideas about about how to change the world, right? How to change the world for the better, how we can make this world a better place. And I study a lot of different things, as you can probably tell through these videos. I also have what else I have in there? Another podcast I was doing, a More Delightful Future, where I interview people in XR and other emerging technology. That's been on hiatus, but there's still some good episodes out there. There's 5 episodes out there right now, and I want to start posting that again some more. And if you want to support me, hit me up on Patreon. I have like one Patreon subscriber that's been with me since like for years now, so I'm super grateful. Shout out to Zach, he's awesome. If you want to support me, feel free to check that out. And as always, thank you for watching. And once again, I said that like 3 times, so I am super grateful. I have like 117 subscribers. I know it's not a lot, but that's a lot. That's 117 people, or at least 100 people that I've never met before. I've never seen your face, never engaged with you before, but you, for some reason, decided to subscribe to my itty bitty channel here. So I'm super grateful. And it's really amazing because, once again, shout out to Dr. Sadler for plugging me. Because last time I did his videos, I had 40 people, 40 subscribers. Now I have 117. That's, over 100% increase, is it doubling? And it's just amazing to see that growth just all of a sudden. So I'm super excited to see where this goes. Even if it doesn't, even if I never get to 1,000 subscribers, it's still amazing that 100 people are subscribed, and a couple dozen people watch these videos now. So thank you again, and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.